You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 524 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Trump nominating a foreign policy restrainer to be in his administration. I have updates on what's going on in Korea and potential talks with the U.S. And then I'm going to look at how Israel is oppressing the Palestinians even worse during the COVID pandemic. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the daily news roundup. Both the roundup and the show are on the homepage libertarianinstitute.org. You could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so some disturbing things going on here at home. Of course, we have these, nationwide lockdowns, and most of us are in some way affected by that, either forced to stay in our home, or potentially even much worse, losing our jobs and not being able to attend, significant events in the lives of yourself and your loved ones, including people going through like chemotherapy and stuff like that I've heard of. That's, pretty rough things going on. But, amid all of this, of course, we have like these individual cases of government abuse that I do want to bring up and talk about, because I think, if it does become a more widespread tool, it could be used to just oppress people for any number of causes. This one is a Kentucky couple, I guess, tested positive, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but the government got word that they were not going to follow their quarantine. It could have even been from them, like telling their doctors, or the doctor saying, hey, you should quarantine. They say, we're not going to do that. Either way, the government finds out that they're planning on not quarantining to whatever, degree the government wants. And then they were equipped with ankle monitors. So something I couldn't find out about this situation, but I'm very interested in, is in most cases, if you're somebody who's, getting probation, out of jail, halfway house situation, will have an ankle monitor. Those are typically pretty expensive programs to be in, up to, I think $100 or so a month, $150 a month at times. So, this could be very expensive to have to be tracked this whole time. And of course, the government putting a GPS monitor on somebody that they can't get off is quite disturbing, especially since it's, for having some, or at least just testing positive, for having this, medical condition or virus. So looking at the big picture, and this is something that I've tried to focus on the show and talk about that I don't think is being discussed enough, but no matter how serious the virus is, and so if this is a cold and there's a lot of people that are dying that just happen to be dying with coronavirus, versus if this is not as bad as the worst predictions, because obviously that hasn't come true, but it's somewhere in the line of like it really does kill a lot of old people, and the only thing we could do is lock down the economy in response. Well, locking down an economy is going to create a lot of like really bad effects, and not even necessarily on the easy to see, but down the road. But so far in 2020, the UN is reporting an additional 10,000 children dying every month due to hunger. And so so a certain number of children on the planet starve every month, and that's just unfortunately the human condition right now. And I think some of that is due to the natural condition of poverty, and then stretching up through oppressive governments and war conditions. And in Yemen, it's just basically being on the wrong end of the U.S. and the Saudi war there. But in this particular case, I guess the UN was looking at the number of children who starved due to like economic conditions. And so, let's say things are shutting down here in the U.S. Well, maybe there is still food on like the shelves and stores in the United States at this point. But then as less food gets exported and stuff like that, and we're talking about all these potatoes being dumped and all kinds of different, stuff like that, where they just don't have the capacity to manufacture all these food items right now, process them and get them in to whatever condition, ship them to where they need to go in that present amount of time because of the economic shutdowns. And so, this is a real cost. And I think the most disturbing thing about this one is that you have people who are mainly suffering from this condition are, the older wealthy people, in the, first world countries typically are, most of the people who are dying of this in the US are above the age of 70 something. I think the like median death is actually older than the average life expectancy. And then of course the older generation of Americans are typically people who, now receive full round, treatment. They live in these retirement centers. I think about half the deaths in the United States were from retirement centers where people, do everything for you. And then here you have people just at the beginning of their life, these, young children who are being deprived of that. And nobody's really talking about that trade-off and how this is, kind of working down the line. Of course, there are a lot of people talking about, and I think this is a really important point too, just the suffering going on here in the United States. It may not be anywhere near 10,000 children suffering and starving to death, but there are an awful lot of children suffering. We've talked about it, and a lot of people have covered like the fact that domestic abuse situations, child abuse situations are getting worse during this time. Opiate deaths, suicides, anything related, to losing your job. These things produce suicides and overdoses and relapses and divorce and abused children. And so all that is getting worse. And there's really no discussion of the consequences of the lockdowns, at least the negative ones. And so I thought this particular story by AP, which if you look at the headline of all these articles, they make it sound like the hunger is just from the virus, like the virus somehow makes people hungry, which isn't necessarily the case. Of course, like if a whole bunch of farmers were to get sick, that may, reduce the amount of potatoes produced in a certain week. But on the, big scale now, it seems so many people want to return to work and the government's preventing them. That's really what's causing these economic consequences that are leading to dead children. One interesting thing, I guess, is kind of what the federal government is choosing to do at these times. So you have, these massive protests going on, right? And the government, who at the same time is saying we need to lock down the entire economy, isn't upset with the protesters being out there violating like the Corona quarantine, which I don't think they should be, just more that these protesters are harassing federal buildings and statues. And so we're sending hundreds of cops, federal police, to cities that they're not normally in, to interact with people very closely. People have been in large crowds day after day, as many of these protesters are. And so you would really think that the government thought the disease was that bad, they wouldn't worry about enforcing this, especially because it seems like so much of the rioting has exacerbated as the federal crackdown has shown up. Another example of this is the feds apparently shut down a $25 million Bitcoin ATM business for not following regulations. And then one more note is apparently the Air Force is using one of their surveillance planes to look at what's happening and monitor to help the federal government and police in Portland. So this seems like it could be and should be a wide discussion and talk about a posse comitatus issue, but that doesn't seem to be where the focus of this is. Almost all the attention, and a lot of it rightly so, is on the federal police there, deployed by Trump. But some of the other things that the U.S. government is doing around these protests with, monitoring the social media and what the, Portland police and the tactics that I used before this aren't getting enough attention, certainly with this Air Force surveillance as well. To get into some good news, Trump has nominated Colonel Douglas Macgregor to be the ambassador to Germany. He is somebody whose name has come up on the show a lot. He was floated, I believe, before and after Bolton was fired, as being a potential national security advisor, somebody who apparently Donald Trump enjoys talking to and listening to, and somebody who's also been on the Scott Horton show. So that's some great news. He's somebody who's written articles at TAC, the American Conservative, and he takes a very restrained position. as far as foreign policy goes. He doesn't, believe in the Russia hysteria. I think he is concerned about China, but certainly not to a absurd extent like, some other people who otherwise have like good foreign policy views on the Middle East. But, we have to do this, that, and the other against China. And it's important to, look at his role here being ambassador to Germany and, his kind of position of the U.S. shouldn't be subsidizing the defense of NATO and all this likely means he will try to implement the Trump policy bringing troops home from Germany. I guess the real positive I see here with Macgregor is that one of the potentials if we removed U.S. troops from Germany was going to be that we could actually send them to Poland, which would kind of undo the gesture, the hope that we would have from removing, troops from Germany, which is it would, de-escalate and be, a sign to Russia that we're not as serious about this NATO buildup and confronting Russia and everything like that. So let's hope that Macgregor can make this happen. Obviously, he'll have Trump's ear more often in this position, or at least, one would hope they just don't ship him off to Germany and then he never gets to talk to Trump again. He's especially good on the Middle East wars. And so even if it comes that, he's not the national security advisor and they're talking about something from Iraq, maybe he can call the president and say, Mr. President, I'm the retired colonel. Let me tell you what my theories are on this. And, this is the guy I think was on Tucker Carlson the night that Iran responded to the U.S. killing Soleimani with that missile attack and, gave a very restrained foreign policy position. The bad news here is that unless Trump gets a second term, this is obviously too little too late. Making him just ambassador to Germany means that, he's not going to put in like a full or be able to advocate and push for, a more full America first, bring the troops home foreign policy. And this is all Donald Trump's fault. He could have made it. He could have made Macgregor the national security advisor instead of John Bolton. Maybe that means that rather than as we approach here the 67th anniversary of the Korean armistice, that we could have a peace deal done rather than remain in a state where there's actually not talks going on now. That's because Trump hired Bolton instead of Macgregor. In a wasted spending bit of news, the Space Force apparently has several horses that are mostly used to just do kind of fish and wildlife. It costs, thousands of dollars every year to maintain these horses. They were the Air Force. Somehow they got put on the Space Force's budget. They don't go into space. They have nothing to do with space. And it's just an example of the massive waste at the Pentagon. There was the fire on the USS Bonhomme, Richard Bonhomme. This caused, I guess, about $4 billion worth of damage when all said and done. The fire did get subdued. Worst case scenarios were avoided here, but it is a sad state of affairs when you look at the U.S. Navy, when you have these ships catching fire in a port like this. Apparently, when there's supposed to be a lot of fail-safes to make sure this doesn't happen. Mark Perry had a great write-up on this at the National Interest, and I'll link to that in the show notes page. A little bit of bad news. Germany rejects a Trump proposal to allow Russia back into the G7, which would make it then the G8. This is the great powers of the world, kind of self-declared. They all get together and meet every few years. After Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, one of the steps that the U.S., Europe, and other countries here took was to kick Russia out of the group. It's a chance for diplomacy between the West and Russia. And for that reason, I want Russia back in. I'm not, a big fan of these international groups or anything like that, or think they're, a solution to world affairs. And hell, in the wrong context, could actually, advocate or push for more war. But in this case, having different kinds of committees where Donald Trump is in small groups with Vladimir Putin is something I definitely advocate for. And maybe with a better ambassador to Germany, assuming that Macgregor gets confirmed by the Senate here, which, another asterisk to all this is, I guess now, I'm not sure if he's acting or just waiting to be confirmed. So, it could even be near the very end of Trump's administration before he even gets confirmed to take the role. But, maybe he could advocate a little bit better to Germany what the U.S. position is and why it's better for Germany and the U.S. to allow Russia back into the what would that be, G8. A ceasefire negotiated between Russia and Ukraine, and I believe, Germany and France were also generally involved in the talks here, have created and implemented a new ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. It's like an extension of the current ceasefire that was in place that has been loosely holding for some time, although, fighting goes back and forth and it escalates. But we're hoping that this new ceasefire does work out a little bit better, and I believe it also has a role of trying to facilitate some more prisoner withdrawals, or not withdrawals, transfers to, get all the people that are POWs back on, the right side of the border there. All right, so as I mentioned before, we have now crossed the 67th year that the Korean War is in an armistice rather than ended with a peace treaty. This is something that didn't have to get to this date, especially with the sabotage that John Bolton did at the Hanoi summit between the United States and North Korea. But it's a good opportunity to just kind of talk about this issue. The fact that the talks there have pretty much stagnated at this point. North Korea seems to be signaling that they're not interested in talks with the Trump administration at this time, even though the South Korean president is pushing to get Trump and Kim together one more time, I guess, to try to pull out a deal at the last minute. I could really see South Korea and Moon Jae-in feeling like if he misses this moment with Donald Trump, he won't get one with Biden, because Biden was, of course, Obama's vice president, and the Obama policy was something, I don't know if they called it strategic patience, but essentially waiting for North Korea to come to the U.S. on their hands and knees and say, all right, we give in, we concede, we'll give up all of our nukes, just relieve sanctions on us. And since that's never going to happen, North Korea really won't have another negotiating partner under the Obama administration, and would then have to wait, 4 or 8 years to be able to, again, have a chance to approach ending this. Of course, as I said there, South Korea is seems to be the interested party in pushing talks right now. One of the reasons South Korea needs a country thousands of miles away in the United States to help facilitate talks isn't just because of the thousands of U.S. soldiers on the Korean peninsula, but because there are sanctions that are in place against North Korea, and South Korea would be violating them without U.S. permissions for waivers. North Korea declared an emergency in a border town after a man who was an exile and traveled to South Korea in 2017 returned, I guess, to his hometown and is believed to have COVID-19. It's unclear. This would be North Korea's first officially confirmed case of COVID. I don't think anybody really believes that stat. And so whether this is some kind of propaganda ploy by the North Korean state or the potential outbreaks of coronavirus in North Korea is yet to be seen. And, it's going to be very hard to actually nail down the details of what's going on in this very oppressive country. This is one of the places where even if you don't think coronavirus is a particularly serious disease, if it does at all, trigger like a respiratory condition similar to like a pneumonia, as a country like North Korea that's so impoverished, maybe one that's hit exceptionally hard. In an interesting, I guess, change to policy, the U.S. is going to help facilitate South Korea launch their own spy satellite with their own rockets. I find this just to be an interesting note because the U.S. made such a big deal over the North Korean space program, and every time they launch a rocket into space, the U.S. calls it an ICBM. All right, so some updates from Afghanistan here. The Taliban say there is no secret annex in the peace agreement, so-called peace agreement that was signed with the United States that will allow U.S. to keep troops in Afghanistan long term. I guess it's nice for the Taliban to say this, but at the end of the day, the U.S. is the world superpower here, and so if we choose to stay in Afghanistan, we will. It could be the Taliban signaling if the U.S. chooses to stay, they're going to take that as a breach of agreement and then respond how I assume the Taliban insurgency has been responding, throughout the war in Afghanistan, which is attacks against U.S. soldiers. The U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan, this is Zalmay Khalilzad, who somewhat successfully, negotiated the eventual what was called a peace agreement between the United States and Taliban, has now returned to Kabul in an attempt to get talks going between the Afghan government and the Taliban. From what I understand from the Pakistanis, that the talks will not occur until the prisoner release. There's supposed to be 5,000 prisoners swapped is finalized. They're getting close to that number, but are still a few hundred short. And now the Taliban are complaining that the Afghan government is actually rounding up and arresting people who were released off of this list, which I'm assuming is going to be problematic, and they're going to then demand that those people get released. And the first half numbers for Afghanistan in 2020 on civilian casualties, I think there's about 3,000 casualties in total, most of those being wounded. Over 1,200 people were killed. A plurality of those killed were killed by the Taliban this year, with a significant number also killed by the Afghan government and U.S. government airstrikes, and then some as well by the Islamic State and other jihadist groups like that. And it's just so sad that the country, has remained so violent. And yes, the U.S. policy really hasn't altered. It's not necessarily that I think Afghanistan would be a paradise if the U.S. left, or possibly the war casualty numbers wouldn't be higher or different, but it's very clear after 19 years of this that the U.S. is just prolonging the violence at this point, and eventually the U.S. won't be able to prolong the violence at this level, and so we'll have to leave, and then it's going to change, probably going to get worse, and then maybe get better. Last thing I want to cover here are just some stories going on about Israel. Two stories dealing with the Israeli treatment of Palestinians during the COVID pandemic, including Israel destroying a Palestinian building. I think it was outside of Hezbollah, and it was destroyed because it didn't have the proper permit. The important conversation here is the wider one about how Israel denies permits to Palestinians for pretty much any building, meaning that once Palestinian buildings get destroyed, Palestinians can't build new ones, and so there's less and less Palestinian structures as time goes on. And then of course there's growing populations and stuff like that going on as buildings age. Develop new areas. If you can't get the permits and can't build new buildings, it causes a real problem. This one's particularly disgusting because it was going to be used as a test center for COVID, and so it potentially aid the tracking of coronavirus. And again, I don't know, you may not be somebody who's big on how deadly the coronavirus is, but I think anybody would agree that if it's going to be harmful, it's going to be most harmful in places like Palestine, like Yemen, like prisons where there's bad health care and tight conditions. An Israeli court, I believe actually the Supreme Court, ruled Palestinian prisoners don't have a right to, social distancing or any other types of the typical COVID protocols, as their prisoners. And it was particularly disturbing because a lot of these people aren't, violent criminals, but just rather people Israel labeled as criminals. The Israeli attacks continue against Syria. This time, Israel carried out an attack against several positions in southern Syria after mortar fire landed near the Israeli border, but apparently landed inside of the Syrian part of the Golan Heights. And so this was, it seems like pretty much just an excuse by Israel to carry out operations against Syrian forces. All right, that's the show. Make sure you share it. Foreign Policy Focus is on the Libertarian Institute, as well as my daily news roundups, both on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org, patreon.com /foreign policy focus, at Kyle Anzalone, Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter, new Twitter handle there. So make sure you check that out. And then private Facebook group at Foreign Policy Focus.